was a grey morning when the longships slipped over a calm sea and into a monastery's harbour. Bare timber and iron glinted. Oars clicked like a foreign heartbeat. Men in wool and leather knelt briefly to check straps and spears, then rose, silent. On the island, the bells were still calling the monks to prayer. By noon, the bells were silenced by smoke. A handful of raiders emptied chests, cut throats, and carried away liturgical silver and people. The rest fled before any organized resistance could form. When news reached the mainland, chroniclers recorded it as an omen, a rupture in the order of the world. The year, they wrote, was 793. That day at Lindisfarne, recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and lamented by contemporary ecclesiastics, has since become a hinge in European memory. It is both an event and a symbol, the moment the North knocked on Europe's fragile door and found it open. But Lindisfarne was not a spontaneous explosion of savagery. It was the visible flash of much older fires, landscapes that shaped people, craft traditions that solved practical problems, social arrangements that made risk profitable, and networks that let a handful of skippers turn a coastal raid into riches that reshaped societies back home. If we want to understand how those men, often called Vikings, a term complicated by meaning and misinterpretation, became, within a generation and then across centuries, the fearless conquerors of medieval Europe, we need to follow each of those fires back to its source. If you enjoy long history told with evidence and story, subscribe. There's more like this every week. Imagine northern Scandinavia, a rugged band of fjords, islands, marshy lowlands, and thin soils cut by steep valleys. Farming was possible in patches, but good arable land was limited. Trees grew tall in sheltered coves and were worked into beams and planks. Rivers ran inland like veins, and the sea opened outward. For the communities that lived there, the horizon was both limit and route. People learned to move where the ground would not easily allow them to settle. This environment matters more than a single metaphor. Geography is not destiny, but it channels choices. Pollen studies and settlement archaeology show a pattern of dispersed farmsteads rather than tightly packed villages. Coastal zones and river mouths concentrate access to fish, timber, and communication. That led to a culture oriented to mobility, boats not just for occasional fishing, but as primary vehicles of movement and exchange. The sea offered more than fish, it offered space. Living on the edge of arable land had social consequences. In the absence of an overwhelmingly centralized state, local power clustered around aristocratic households, jarls and their followers, and free farmers, carls, who held rights and land. Beneath them were thralls, enslaved people who did much of the hard labor. Kin groups, assemblies called things, and networks of obligation created a social fabric where honor, reputation, and success in competition mattered hugely. Archaeologists find graves that speak to status differences. Law codes recorded later in Iceland and elsewhere hint at disputes resolved by oath and negotiation, not by royal bureaucracy. Storytellers and poets preserved a cultural grammar that elevated feats of boldness and the pursuit of status. Honor operated like an incentive system. In an honor economy, reputation translates into access to women, to followers, to gifts, and to political leverage. A successful raid, one that returned with silver, slaves, or prestige, could lift a man's standing considerably. The sagas, composed centuries later but echoing older values, make clear how fame and memory matter. But we must treat those texts as a window full of reflection and later literary shaping rather than an eyewitness account. Still, when archaeology aligns with legal records and contemporary chronicles, a coherent picture emerges. Martial success and mobility were not oddities. They were socially valuable activities in a context where other avenues to wealth and power were limited. Technology is where motive encounters possibility. The clinker-built warship, often called the longship in popular language, was the practical instrument that turned coastal fishermen and farmers into seaborne raiders. Clinker construction means thin oak planks overlapped and riveted, creating a hull that is both strong and flexible. The technique appears across the North Sea rim in ship timbers and burials. The Oseberg and Gokstad ships from Norway and the Skuldelev vessels excavated near Roskilde are among the best preserved examples. They are not mere museum pieces. They are demonstrations of engineering choices. Light enough to be carried or beached, shallow enough to slip up rivers, and long and low enough to be fast under oars and sail. A longship is a compromise among conflicting demands, speed, seaworthiness, and the ability to approach unprepared shores. The flexible hull could ride a chop that would cripple a heavier merchant vessel. A mixed propulsion system, oars for maneuver, and a square sail for longer distances meant a crew could strike quickly and disappear before land-based forces could respond. The steering arrangement of the time was typically a steering oar set on the starboard side. Later, medieval innovations would yield stern-post rudders, but for the Viking Age the steering oar was adequate and robust. Navigation in the North Atlantic was an art built on long experience. Celestial cues, sun and stars, were important. Birds and sea color indicated proximity to land. The feel of swell and the smell of shore gave clues to experienced sailors. There are hints in Norse sources and in later experimental archaeology of optical aids like sunstones used to locate the sun through cloud and fog, though the evidence is debated. What archaeologists and sailors agree on is that people who grew up reading currents and wind could operate with uncanny reliability at sea and, crucially, along coasts and rivers where surprise mattered. The ship is a technological frame, but it lives in a system. Timber economies supported specialized shipwrights. Control of hides, ironwork, and sailcloth fed industries that could outfit multiple vessels. Coastal markets such as Ribe and Birka, identified through excavation and coin finds, show a pattern of exchange in which imported silver, jewelry, and finished goods circulated widely. Numismatic evidence is particularly revealing. Hoards of Middle Eastern silver dirhams in Scandinavia, traced through dye analysis and hoard contexts, reveal surprisingly far-reaching connections. Loose silver was a medium of value long before standardized coinage became common. It was easily carried and could be melted, crafted, and distributed. In this way, a plundered chalice from your monastery could be melted, recast, and the silver would then buy a ship or pay a crew. All these elements, land scarcity, an honor-driven social structure, ship technology, and integrated markets, make raids intelligible as strategic choices rather than inexplicable cruelty. But strategy also requires targets. Why monasteries? Why coastal churches? The answer mixes the practical and the symbolic. Monasteries in the British Isles, on Atlantic coasts and islands, were repositories of wealth. They held silver, gold, liturgical objects, and sometimes food and livestock. They were also lightly defended and often isolated on promontories or islands where ships could come and go with little detection. For an audacious mariner, a monastery was an attractive option, a high return for a low immediate cost. Contemporary responses framed these attacks in cosmic terms. Clerical writers saw them as divine chastisement or evidence of the end times. Alcuin of York, who composed letters in the wake of the Lindisfarne raid, interpreted the violence within a theological horizon that made it an existential warning. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the event as a calamity, and distressed communities wrote of the moral and spiritual shock of seeing churches desecrated. Their horror was real, and their theological reading shaped a cultural memory in which the Northmen arrived not merely as thieves, but as agents of disorder. But what the Christian writers apprehended emotionally, archaeologists and historians reconstruct materially. Coastal sites show signs both of sudden violence and of longer patterns of interaction. Some islands and estuaries that once hosted monastic communities show burned layers and palimpsest occupation. In other places, one sees continuity. Trade continues, markets adapt, and over time newcomers and locals negotiate arrangements. That capacity to pivot from raid to relationship is central to the Viking transformation. To see how, follow the money. The silver that poured into Scandinavia, whether through plunder or through trade, was not an inert sink. Workshops in trading towns produced jewelry and hack silver. Hoards found in burial contexts and suburban dumps suggest an economy increasingly mediated by portable wealth. Archaeologists have catalogued finds from Birka on Lake Mälaren, from Ribe on the Jutland coast, and from Jorvik in England, that show manufactured goods of Norse origin, Anglo-Saxon objects, and dirhams from the Abbasid Caliphate. Coin hoards buried inland in Sweden and Gotland are particularly suggestive. They speak to merchant networks linking the north to the Islamic world, often via rivers and steppe trade routes. Once silver and slaves circulate back to Scandinavia, the incentives change. A man whose share of a raid buys him land, or craftsman can cement his power at home. A successful captain gains followers who expect ongoing opportunity. The equipment that makes a raid possible, ships, weapons, networks of exchange, becomes an instrument not just of episodic violence, but of sustained enterprise. The frequencies of raids increase and practices evolve. Groups begin to overwinter in foreign lands, to establish base camps, and to exploit river systems deep inland, where monastic wealth is no longer protected by the sea. This escalation is visible in the sources. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, when read in a longue durée, shows an evolution from isolated coastal strikes to more complex campaigns over a few decades. By the mid-9th century, a force described later as the Great Heathen Army, recorded in chronicles and problematic in its later saga reception, lands in England around the mid-860s. This force is not a small band of opportunists. It is a group capable of concerted operations, of overwintering, and of seizing towns and territories. Where earlier raids took loot and fled, these forces held ground. Hold that evolution in memory, because it helps explain the qualitative change, the raider as merchant, as settler, as ruler. It would be a mistake to imagine a straight line. The process was messy, contingent, and regionally variable. In some places, raiding subsided as trade and settlement integrated newcomers. In others, military pressure forced accommodations or resistance. Political responses ranged from violent expulsion to negotiated treaties. The Treaty of Wedmore, often dated to 878 after the campaigns of Alfred the Great and the leadership of warriors like Guthrum, marks one such negotiated outcome. Boundaries were drawn. In places, Scandinavian law and English institutions coexisted, producing the Danelaw. Archaeology corroborates this blend. Different burial practices, house forms, and material culture in parts of eastern England point to a hybridized society rather than simple domination. The story of expansion is not limited to the British Isles. The Atlantic corridor tells its own tale of mobility and settlement. In the late 9th and 10th centuries, Norse seafarers left the Scandinavian mainland to found communities in Iceland and Greenland. The written record, sagas compiled in Iceland in the 12th and 13th centuries, products of memory and literary shaping, preserves tales of charismatic leaders like Eric the Red, who led groups westward in episodes that probably crystallize an earlier migratory reality. Archaeology has given independent confirmation. Settlement patterns in Iceland date from around the late 9th century, and the Althing, the assembly that would be recorded from 930, suggests a political sophistication and an appetite for institution building among settlers. Greenlandic sites reveal Norse farms adapted to a colder, maritime environment. They also show trade in walrus ivory and connections to Europe. And then there is Lons Meadows, the Norse site at the tip of Newfoundland, whose dendrochronology and material remains date to around the turn of the first millennium and provide the first unequivocal evidence of Norse presence in North America. The presence of that encampment confirms an astonishing capacity for long-range voyaging and ephemeral colonization. Even if the Norse presence in North America did not produce long-term European settlement in the way the Atlantic islands and Greenland did. On the other axis, rivers opened eastward. From the Baltic, well inland along freshwater arteries, Norsemen, often labeled Varangians in Byzantine and Arabic texts, traveled to the Black Sea and the Caspian, engaging as traders, mercenaries, and political brokers. Accounts like that of Ahmad ibn Fadlan in the early 10th century, an Arab diplomat who encountered a group of Northmen traveling along the Volga, offer an outsider's contemporary perspective on these routes, though his account should be read with care and attention to the genre in which it was written. Archaeology again confirms connectivity. Durham hoards found in Scandinavia, combined with evidence of Scandinavian artifacts in the east, show active exchange. The figure of Rurik, named in later chronicles as a leader who established rule in parts of what would become Kievan Rus, occupies a space where saga, chronicle, and archaeology intersect. Here, too, the Norse role is not neatly uniform. In some cases, they were the elite core of emergent polities. In others, they were traders or mercenaries assimilated into existing societies. Back home, the inflows of wealth and the institutional demands they created produced political change. Wealth caches funded retinues and constructed houses of power. Increasingly, leaders sought ways to make gains durable: marriage alliances, land grants, control of port towns, and engagement with continental powers. The process of converting raiding capacity into governance is neither mechanical nor immediate. It involves negotiation with local elites, the adaptation of Norse legal practices, and eventually, religious change. The introduction and spread of Christianity into Scandinavian ruling classes is a pivotal element in that transformation. Conversion did not erase Norse traditions overnight, nor was it a uniform top-down process imposed by foreign missionaries. Instead, conversion often began pragmatically. Alliances with Christian rulers, commercial convenience, and the prestige of affiliation with Europe's dominant religious institutions all played parts. Rulers who adopted Christianity often did so to legitimize their rule in a European context, to gain diplomatic standing, and to access literate networks. These conversions, formalized in royal acts in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, helped shift the balance away from autonomous raiding bands and towards centralized monarchies with administrative capacity. Church infrastructure, parishes, bishops, written law, tied local elites into broader European frameworks and provided institutional glue for the emergent states. All of these developments, ships and seamanship, trade and wealth flows, settlement and legal adaptation, religious change and state formation, compose the causal chain that links the shock of 793 to the later image of Vikings as conquerors, urban founders, mercenaries, and monarchs. The sea that once enabled quick strikes now carried settlers and merchants and armies. The same shallow draft hull that slipped up a creek to plunder also enabled long-distance migration and logistical supply. But causality works through contingency as much as through necessity. A raid that succeeded could create a local base or trigger a countermeasure. A town that welcomed trade could become a magnet for settlers. A royal conversion could redirect the prestige economy toward new ends. Consider one microcosm where these forces meet: a port city that eventually becomes Jorvik, modern York. Before the Viking presence, York is a significant urban center in Northumbria. After repeated attacks and then occupation in the late 9th century, the city's archaeological record changes in ways that speak to both disruption and integration. Norse-style houses, imported goods, new coinage practices, and burial customs emerge alongside traces of Anglo-Saxon continuity. Pottery kilns and craft workshops indicate a local economy adapting to new demands. The city did not simply become a Norse colony in isolation. It became a hybrid urban center, a node in the wider North Sea network, where people of different origins lived, traded, litigated, and governed together. That hybridization is a critical ingredient of conquest. Domination here means not only military superiority, but the capacity to insert Norse elites into existing economic and political structures, and to make Norse ways productive in new contexts. The moral calculus of this history requires care. Violence was part of the story, and that violence had human costs. Yet when we isolate acts of brutality without following the ensuing social transformations, the creation of towns, the reorientation of trade, the legal accommodations, we risk missing how the Viking phenomenon operated as a coherent historical force. Conquest, in this sense, was often a process of incorporation, of people and ideas, goods and laws, liturgy and language. By the time the 10th and 11th centuries roll on, the map of Europe bears the imprint of those processes. Norse names label rivers, towns, and laws. Scandinavian rulers sit on thrones, from Dublin to England to Copenhagen and beyond, and medieval polities absorb elements of Norse governance into their own emerging monarchies. Meanwhile, in Iceland, an assembly, the Althing, records laws, disputes, and memory in ways that later generations will read as the institutional mirror to the social energies that sent their ancestors westward. But how does this story scale? How did groups of men in a few boats become the architects of urban economies, the founders of dynasties, and the middlemen between Baghdad and the Baltic? The answer lies in the dynamics we've traced. Technology that amplified mobility, social structures that rewarded bold action, networks that converted loot into urban capital, and an adaptability that turned raiding into rulership. Yet none of these is sufficient on its own. The decisive moves, the moments when raiding hardened into ruling, come where opportunity meets organization and where local elites choose accommodation over annihilation. One such decisive move is the formation of organized armies capable of more than quick coastal strikes. Another is the creation of market towns that anchored trade and legitimized foreign presence. Both require logistical sophistication, supply, wintering arrangements, legal frameworks to regulate relationships between newcomers and locals. The archaeological record, pollen diagrams showing new agriculture, graves showing different acculturation patterns, coin hoards signaling payments and savings, testifies that such logistical underpinnings were indeed in place. As the narrative unfolds, we must also keep returning to the cultural lens. Norse cosmology and values, concepts of honor, fate, and fame, provided a moral grammar for risk and reward. For some men, the hope of a glorious death and remembrance in stanza and story might have inspired perilous voyages. For others, the economic calculus was straightforward. Where modern readers might insist on a single driver, the medieval record supports a multiplicity: belief and calculation, religion and profit, improvisation and institution. If the Lindisfarne raid introduced a terrifying new actor onto Europe's stage, what followed in its wake shows how a combination of maritime mastery, social incentives, and economic opportunity could translate episodic success into structural influence. The next chapters of this transformation are visible in the way raids became settlements, in the scale of military campaigns that could hold territory, and in the political bargains, like Wedmore, that reconfigured sovereignty. In the coming decades, the North would not only take, it would govern, legislate, and intermarry. For now, though, we must linger on the immediate aftermath of those first blows. What happened when a ship returned home laden with silver and captives? How did that windfall reorganize life in a fjord or a river valley? And how did local leaders convert booty into institutions that could sustain power over time? To answer those questions, we need to move from longship and monastery to village and hall, to look at the workshops where melted chalices became jewelry, At the assembly fields where things debated rights, at the household where a leader's newfound wealth called followers and obligations into being. Here, the archaeological record and later legal texts provide a surprisingly intimate tableau of social change. In graves near trading centers, one finds the traces of foreign goods transformed into local status symbols. Brooches with Eastern silver, weapons blunted through ritual use, and imported glass turned into beads. In settlement layers, structures once small and ephemeral give way to more complex halls with outbuildings, suggesting the rise of patrons who could host feasts, adjudicate disputes, and command men. Feasting is not mere indulgence, it is currency. In a society where gifts create bonds, the ability to host and distribute wealth binds followers and cements obligations. That ability grows with access to silver and trade. Men who return from a successful voyage can convert loot into feasts that translate into long-term loyalty. Over time, a pattern emerges. Leaders who can sustain followers through redistribution become better positioned to organize larger expeditions, to defend territory, and to negotiate with foreign rulers. Thus, a cycle of accumulation, redistribution, and institutionalization turns irregular piracy into organized power. At the same time, markets change what success looks like. In early centuries, portable wealth, silver, jewelry, slaves dominates. But as towns grow, as craft specialization increases, and as foreign merchants bring standardized coinage, the economics of power shifts toward control over trade routes and urban centers. A lord who controls a port can extract tariffs, regulate markets, and coordinate shipping. Control over towns like Ribe or Berka confers something closer to state capacity than episodic raiding ever could. This process of urbanization and economic integration is not swift or inevitable. It is messy, contested, and locally specific. In some places, the newcomers assimilated into local political structures. In others, they remain distinct colonizing elites. Yet across the North Sea and Baltic worlds, a new pattern takes hold. The same maritime competence that once produced surprise attacks now supports commerce and settlement. And with that commerce comes a new basis for power. What does all this mean for our initial question, how the Vikings of 793 AD became Europe's fearless conquerors? It means that conquest here was a compound phenomenon. The initial shock mattered because it exposed a capability. But capabilities require systems, social incentives, technological platforms, economic outlets, and political openings. In the remainder of our story, we will trace how those openings were seized and institutionalized, how overwintering camps became towns, how raiding fleets became a core that could besiege cities, how riverbanks that once hosted quick strikes became the veins of trade linking the north to Byzantium and Baghdad. We will meet the men whose names survive in legend and chronicles, the semi-legendary leaders whose stories shaped memory, and we will sift their narratives against coins, timbers, and graves to separate later invention from earlier reality. For now, the picture has sharpened. Lindisfarne is not an anomaly, but a symptom. It revealed a system capable of surprise, mobility, and extraction. It showed Europe a new kind of neighbor, one that could be terrifying, adaptable, and, in time, politically consequential. As ships again fill with men, not to plunder but to settle, trade, or fight, the question is no longer whether these northerners can raid. It is how they will use their maritime mastery to become something far more consequential. The answer unfolds in campaigns that require logistics on a continental scale, in the stitching of legal practices across rivers and coasts, and in the social transformations that turn plunder into patronage. Those are the stories that follow. The massing of armies on English sands, the foundation of towns that would become keys to empires, the movement of people across the Atlantic and down river valleys into the courts of Byzantium. Each step will show how a maritime people adapted their strengths to changing opportunities and, in doing so, reshaped Europe's political and cultural map. Before that transformation is complete, however, there is an intimate stage to examine: the internal reordering in Scandinavian homelands. How did villages and kin groups absorb sudden swells of silver? How did the whole culture morph into royal courts? What legal and religious shifts made rulership more durable? Those shifts are subtle but crucial. They convert episodic male bonding among raiders into institutional hierarchies that can command taxation, enforce law, and project force beyond the reach of a single season. We will begin that deeper dive with the material evidence: ship burials and high-status graves like Oseberg, coin hoards that trace the flow of silver, the remains of workshops that show burgeoning craft specialization. From these remains, oak planks, iron rivets, silver cut into fragments, we will reconstruct the domestic engines that made conquest sustainable. The transformation from shock to structure rests on such mundane things as a smith's forge and a leader's capacity to host a winter feast. Those domestic engines are the quiet mechanisms of historical power. And so the story moves inland, from hull to hall, from oar to oath. The men who sailed in 793 returned to fjords and rivers with stories and silver. Some married and raised their status. Others invested in ships and sent crewmates back to the same coasts that had once been vulnerable. The pattern multiplied. Over decades, the practice hardened into expectation. It is in the interplay of expectation and institution, where raiding is not only possible but profitable and organized, that the Viking phenomenon becomes coherent enough to produce conquests. The next moment to examine is a series of transformations that turn ephemeral raids into political facts on the ground. The establishment of bases that overwinter, the founding of market towns, and the articulation of legal norms in mixed communities. Each of these requires attention to specific cases: York, Dublin, and parts of the Danelaw, the formation of national rhythms in Norway and Denmark, and the patterning of saintly cults and bishops that provided religious legitimacy. By following these threads, we will see how raiding fed trade, how trade sustained settlement, and how settlement enabled political authority. Only when those links are clear can we say how the Northmen transformed from raiders in longships into conquerors who sat on thrones and administered justice. The path is neither inevitable nor simple, but it is traceable. In the chapters ahead, we will walk it step by step, through coins and timbers, through laws and marriages, through siege works and treaties, until the image of the Viking as both fearsome raider and founder of order become intelligible as two sides of the same historical coin. We begin inland, where the outward motion of ships met the quieter, harder work of turning sudden inflows of wealth into sustainable power. Imagine a fjord hamlet in the later 9th century. Children run between turf houses, a smith hammers at a glowing blade, and on the shore a plank frame lies half-finished. The man who returns from a voyage with a chest of hacksilver is not merely richer for a season. He has a new capacity to host, arm, and adjudicate. That capacity has ripple effects. Archaeology lets us watch some of those ripples. High-status graves, Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway, contain objects that speak to both ritual and political display: finely carved wooden panels, imported textiles, richly furnished burial boats. They tell us that elite households invested in conspicuous goods and skilled artisans. Excavations of halls and associated middens reveal larger domestic complexes replacing more modest homesteads, with specialized outbuildings and evidence of craft production nearby. These physical changes are the domestic scaffolding of longer reach: halls that can host larger retinues, smiths who can rearm men, and storehouses that hold provisions through winter. Feasting and redistribution are the social technology that turns loot into loyalty. In a gift-based economy, the leader who can disperse silver and food secures bonds of obligation. That leader can then summon men for further expeditions, levy tribute, or enforce local judgments. Legal texts recorded later in Iceland and mediated through oral tradition show how honor, oath, and gift exchange structured political life. Those sources are late and literary, yet they preserve a logic of ceremonial bestowal and reciprocal obligation that archaeology corroborates. The greater the capacity to redistribute, the greater the capacity to command. One visible institutional innovation born of this internal reordering was the development of permanent bases abroad, places to overwinter and to refit. Accounts in Frankish annals and in English chronicles note the appearance of winter encampments in parts of Britain and Ireland in the 9th century. The difference between a raid that takes a ship's worth of silver and a campaign that stays through the winter is immense. The latter requires provisioning, organization, and a degree of political planning. When groups began to overwinter on foreign shores, they were not merely opportunists. They were practicing logistical, sustained presence. Bases enabled sieges, the control of river mouths, and the consolidation of captured territory into holdings that could be managed and defended. We can see that logistical evolution in the archaeological record of places like Dublin and York. Jorvik, after the mid-9th century, shifts in material composition. Excavations at Coppergate revealed a bustling urban economy. Workshops, imported weights for trade, coinage, and evidence of metalworking. The Cuerdal hoard, unearthed in the Ribble Valley, is a striking numismatic statement. A mass of coins and hack silver, including Islamic dirhams, Anglo-Saxon pennies, and continental pieces, buried in what is plausibly a merchant or war chest. Its existence suggests both the scale of silver flows and the need to secure wealth in times of danger. In such contexts, wealth is not merely spent on feasts. It undergirds markets, funds, shipbuilding, and supports standing war bands that can become instruments of territorial control. Military organization itself evolved. Early raiding favored speed and surprise. Later campaigns, those recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Continental Annals, display more planning. Fleets assembling, troops overwintering, and coordinated movements across river systems. The great heathen army that arrives in England in the mid-860s, the Chronicles' phrasing is our principal record, demonstrates a shift in scale and intent. This force is described as remaining on land for months, taking fortified towns and wintering. Whether we choose the label army or coalition of warbands, the implication is the same. This was not a one-season enterprise. It required supply lines, leaders with huskarls and retainers, and the capacity to govern occupied territory. The British response changed in turn. Kings like Alfred the Great innovated defensive measures, burhs or fortified towns, intended to deny raiders the easy access that earlier centuries had permitted. Alfred's reforms, including the mobilization of local levies and the reorganization of coinage, are recorded in later English sources and are visible in the distribution of fortifications in archaeology. These defensive institutions changed the calculus of raiding, attacks phased toward larger strategic objectives rather than quick plunder, and raiders faced a landscape of fortifications that made small-scale strikes riskier. That is one reason some raids shifted into settlement and negotiation. When plunder became harder to seize quickly, the payoff of settling and controlling trade grew. The transformation is especially clear in the way law and custom adapted in the Danelaw. The Treaty of Wedmore, commonly associated with the aftermath of 878 and the interactions between Alfred and the Danish leader Guthrum, is our emblem of negotiated settlement. Territory demarcated, limits on jurisdiction, and an uneasy coexistence of laws. Archaeological patterns in eastern England show Scandinavian-style houses and burial practices emerging alongside Anglo-Saxon continuities. Place names ending in by Thorpe and Thwaite register the imprint of Norse language on the English landscape. Institutional hybridization, where Norse customary law and Anglo-Saxon local governance interpenetrate, produced something that looks less like conquest as extermination and more like conquest as acculturation. winners and losers creating new local forms together. On the continent, the story of scale and siege culminates in dramatic episodes such as the fleet that sailed up the Seine to Paris. The Annales Bertiniani and other Frankish sources report a fleet of ships arriving in 845, forcing Charles the Bold to buy them off with tribute. Later narratives, some of them shaped by saga tradition, inflate names and gestures. The saga's association of men like Ragnar with the Paris raids belongs to memory as much as to fact, and must be so treated. But the core is documentary. Large numbers of ships could threaten the heart of Frankish polities, to be met sometimes by payments, sometimes by military confrontation. The willingness of continental rulers to pay tribute, Danegeld, reveals that raiding was not merely a phenomenon of petty desperation, but a strategic fact that Western polities needed to accommodate or confront. Beyond tribute, some Vikings transformed raiding fleets into political bargaining chips within continental politics. Mercenary service for Frankish and other lords was not unknown. Likewise, intermarriage with local elites gradually integrated Norse leaders into the aristocratic networks that governed Europe. These processes blurred the line between outsider raids and insider rule. Parallel to developments in northern and western Europe were outward colonization projects in the Atlantic and southeastern expansion along riverine corridors. Iceland and Greenland show how raiding peoples could become settlers in a remarkably short number of generations. The Icelandic settlement, dated archaeologically and through land namings to the late 9th and early 10th centuries, created a society that developed legal institutions, the Althing, established by 930 according to saga accounts and supported by archaeological settlement patterns that read as an adaptive response to a frontier environment. In Greenland, archaeological evidence of Norse farms, church ruins, and trade in walrus ivory ties the Norse to long-distance commodity circuits that connected the North Atlantic to markets farther south. And L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland offers incontrovertible physical evidence of Norse presence in North America around 1000 CE. Timber structures, iron-working residues, and radiocarbon dates align to confirm episodic colonial ventures to the New World. Those Western voyages illustrate an important point. Mobility begets options. The same seamanship that made coastal raids feasible also allowed ambitious men to relocate entirely, to chase new opportunities beyond the reach of established polities. In some cases, colonizing meant economic marginalization. Greenland would eventually slip out of European economic networks as climate shifted and walrus demand fell. In others, settlement led to long-lasting polities. Norway, Iceland, and parts of the British Isles show durable Norse cultural imprints. To the east, river routes defined a different but equally consequential trajectory. The Varangians, Norsemen who traveled along the Dnieper and Volga, are visible in Byzantine and Arabic texts as traders, raiders, and mercenaries. Ahmad ibn Fadlan's early 10th century account of Norse groups on the Volga remains one of the most vivid outsider testimonies of the era. It describes ritual, clothing, and the violence and sophistication of Norse travelers in a way that complements archaeological traces. The primary chronicle, a later East Slavic compilation, names Rurik as a leader who established rule in parts of what would become Kievan Rusi. The chronology and the politics of these foundational narratives are debated, yet the broad fact stands. Norse actors played formative roles in the formation of polities stretching from the Baltic into the Black and Caspian regions. Trade in furs, slaves, and silver, often mediated by dirhams moving westward, turned river towns into nodes that linked Scandinavia to Byzantium and the Islamic world. An additional channel of Norse influence flowed through service. The Varangian Guard of Byzantium, composed in part of Norsemen serving as elite guards and mercenaries, symbolizes how Norse martial skills translated into political capital within the courts of great empires. Those who served in Constantinople returned with wealth, contacts, and prestige. Material culture on the Scandinavian periphery shows objects and ideas moving along these routes. Within Scandinavia, these outward connections fed back into political consolidation. Wealth returned from trade, mercenary pay, and ecclesiastical patronage fueled the rise of dynastic power in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. In Denmark, runic monuments like the Jellingstones, commissioned by Harald Bluetooth in the 10th century, are archaeological signals of royal authority in Christian adoption. Harald's conversion and his declaration, inscribed in stone, stand as a public act of state formation. Christian kingship becomes a technology of legitimacy that links northern rulers to continental Europe's cultural and diplomatic networks. Norway's path to centralization is messier and more contested in sources. Later saga traditions ascribe unifying roles to figures like Harald Fairhair, but historians caution that the consolidation of kingship was a protracted process, mediated by local elites and contingent politics. Nonetheless, by the 10th and 11th centuries, more durable royal structures emerge, along with the administrative capacities, taxation, retinues, and law that could sustain larger external projects. In England, the apex of Norse political success appears in the early 11th century with Knut the Great. Knut's kingship, ruling over England, Denmark, and parts of Norway, shows how Norse leadership could convert martial prowess into legitimate trans-North Sea monarchy. His reign blends Norse and Anglo-Saxon governance, uses ecclesiastical networks for administration, and speaks to the ultimate possibility of immigrant rulers becoming the ruling class. Religious conversion is central to the shift from raiding to rulership. Converting to Christianity did not erase Norse identity, but it provided a framework of literacy, diplomacy, and supra-regional belonging that royal houses could use. Missionary activity, kingly baptisms, and the building of churches were part of a broader strategy. Religion as statecraft, saints' cults, bishoprics, and written law, often drafted in Latin or under ecclesiastical influence, anchor rulers to continental institutions and networks. This weaving of spiritual and political authority weakened the old incentives for raiding in some contexts. In a Christianized elite, the religious cost of attacking churches in fellow Christian lands was higher, and diplomacy and intermarriage became more attractive ways to secure wealth and prestige. At the same time, Christianization did not end violence or erase Norse cultural memory. Sagas and runic inscriptions show how old ideas, honor, fame, a taste for heroic narrative, survived and adapted within a Christian framing. Leaders negotiated identities, deploying Christianity for legitimacy, while preserving rituals and social languages that retained a Norse flavor. The result was hybrid elites who could operate within European diplomatic circuits, yet still claim the cultural memory of seafaring adventure. By the 11th century, the scale and character of Norse activity had shifted decisively. Raids continued, but they were increasingly episodic and often politically framed. Royal expeditions, mercenary raids, or dynastic struggles, rather than the open-ended coastal plundering of earlier centuries. The end of the classic Viking Age is complex and gradual, but several markers suggest closure. The consolidation of stronger royal states in England and on the continent made small-scale raiding harder. The spread of fortifications, organized navies, and more effective local policing reduced the opportunity space for seasonal predation. Christianization altered norms and networks, steering elites toward diplomacy and courtly culture. Economic integration, markets, towns, and monetary systems created different incentives. Controlling ports and trade routes became more profitable than the uncertainty of plunder. Symbolically, the year 1066 is commonly invoked. Harald Hardrada's defeat and death at Stamford Bridge that September, followed weeks later by the Norman conquest at Hastings, has been framed as the end of one era and the start of another. Harold's death represents the last great pitched northern expedition to England. And while Norse influence continued in politics and culture, the pattern of sustained raiding of previous centuries had already been on the wane. If we step back and evaluate the causal chain from 793 to the 11th century, the pattern is clear. Lindisfarne mattered because it revealed a capability, a maritime, mobile force that could strike where defenses were weak. That revelation prompted responses. Defensive innovation in affected polities, but also opportunistic exploitation of European politics by Norse actors. Technology mattered. Clinker construction, shallow draft, and versatile sail and oar systems made surprise and riverine penetration possible. Social structure mattered. An honor economy and kinship-based followings rewarded risk and boldness. Economic networks mattered. Dirhams and trade connected Scandinavia to the Islamic world and Byzantine realms, while market towns anchored wealth locally. Political adaptation mattered. Some leaders converted plunder into patronage, forming retinues and building halls that could serve as the nuclei of nascent states. Religious adaptation mattered. Conversion to Christianity created new legitimacy and diplomatic networks. The interaction of these mechanisms produced transformation. The imprint of that transformation is everywhere in medieval Europe. In language, English retains thousands of Old Norse loanwords, everyday words for things like sky, sky, leg, legger, leg, and place names across northern Britain. In law, the institutional memory of assemblies, things, the Icelandic althing, shaped legal cultures. In towns, Dublin, York, and the Scandinavian trading centres endured as urban nodes long after the first raids. In art and craft, interlaced designs, animal styles, and innovations in metalwork influenced continental aesthetics. Archaeological finds from Ribe to Repton reveal stylistic blends. In memory, sagas, runestones, and chronicles fed a European imagination that remembered the North as both threat and resource. We should resist two temptations. First, to reduce Vikings to mere marauders. That image misses the fullness of their roles as traders, settlers, kings, and cultural brokers. Second, to romanticize them uncritically. Violence and enslavement were real and consequential. Monasteries were desecrated, lives were damaged, and communities displaced. Understanding must hold both truths, the brutality and the capacity to build. Consider again a microcosm, a coastal community in eastern England around 900 CE. A man of Scandinavian background runs a workshop, making brooches from silver that once was a chalice. He sits on a landholding recorded in both Norse and English legal terms. His neighbors speak a dialect with Norse inflections. Their law is a hybrid of custom and royal decree. When the harvest is thin, the same community's heirs can expect trade to bring in grain from across the North Sea. On feast days, liturgy is read in a church whose altar might once have been plundered by an earlier generation. The memory of violence is not erased, but it is incorporated into a living, hybrid society. At the macro scale, the Norse legacy in Europe is one of diffusion and adaptation. Some regions showed durable Norse ruling dynasties, Dublin, Normandy, itself carved out by Norse settlers who adopted French language and Christianity, and later the Anglo-Danish kings. Other regions absorbed vocabulary, legal norms, and settlement patterns without wholesale cultural replacement. Everywhere, the sea ceased to be merely a boundary and instead became an artery of exchange and contact. The story told by timber and coin and law is not teleological. It does not argue that Vikings were predestined to rule Europe. It shows instead how a combination of environment, technology, social organization, economic opportunity, and political adaptation produced a historically contingent path from the shock of 793 to the Norse presence at the center of medieval affairs. Lindisfarne was a catalyst. It revealed capacity and created reaction. What followed was a century and more of experimentation. raiding, trading, settling, governing, until Norse actors occupied roles that medieval Europe recognized as normal: kings, merchants, mercenaries, and settlers. In closing, answer the title directly. How did the Vikings of 793 become Europe's fearless conquerors? Not by a single plan, but by the confluence of multiple forces. Their ships built a technological edge. Their social values made risk socially profitable. Their markets and far-flung connections converted loot into sustained capital. Their capacity to settle turned episodic violence into durable presence. And their willingness to adapt, politically and religiously, allowed leaders to claim legitimacy within the same European systems they once attacked. Those converging mechanisms over decades made possible what a single raid could only hint at: a northern world that was not merely feared but central to the political and economic life of medieval Europe. If this account has sparked your curiosity, there are deeper stories to follow. The archaeology of specific towns, the numismatic trails of dirhams and pennies, the Byzantine sources on the Varangians, and the saga literature's complex memory work. For now, however, the arc is clear. From the smoke-filled shore of Lindisfarne in 793 to the courts of kings in Dublin, York, and Constantinople, a people shaped by sea and scarcity, by craft and custom, reshaped Europe in turn. Their fearlessness was practical as much as cultural, an ability to move, to adapt, and to turn chance into institution. That is how a raid became a revolution in medieval order. If you found this exploration rewarding, watch our deep dives on Viking urbanism in Jorvik and on the Varangian Guard, links in the playlist. Like, subscribe, and share this with someone who loves long-form history and will continue to follow the planks, coins, and laws that connect past and present.